And then let me share this. So please let me know if everyone can see the screen. Can everyone see this okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, good.
Okay, great. So just a quick introduction to today. Same as every other week, what we're going to be doing today is give an overview of our findings. I'm going to be talking about key findings from our user interviews. And when I hand over to Tom, he's going to talk about his insights from stakeholder interviews and insights from all the data that the councils have been sharing and from Google Analytics as well. Essentially, today is not for us to go through everything with a fine comb and look at all the detail, but it's to give an overview of findings and for us to discuss what went well, what we struggled with, and with one more week to go next week, just see if there's anything that we need to keep in mind ahead of the final week of research. So just to crack on then, today is about revenues and benefits. And myself and Kyle were in Redditch conducting user interviews. And what we have found then from the 7 people that we interviewed this week, first of all, is that all the users that we spoke with started their journeys at a point of anxiety and disadvantage. Essentially due to life circumstances, something has happened in their life, some change has happened that they need some help and support, or they were frustrated due to maybe a mistake made by the council. This could be something like a letter has come through the post, like with maybe an unexpected bill, or they're been put in the wrong tax band. Something like that, but essentially something has happened, some event has happened that means that they have to go and get something sorted or get help. But everyone is essentially experiencing anxiety, fear, or frustration, especially at the start of this journey. Because of that, we found that actually people need a lot of reassurance. We spoke to a lot of people who were quite emotionally distressed. Anything to do with money will have a big impact on their lives. We found that especially if things aren't going to plan, or if the council had made a mistake on billing, people need that reassurance that things are going to be okay, and they need to feel like they're in control of the situation because of the impact on their life and because of the high risk associated with not getting it sorted. What this ultimately means is that if you need that extra reassurance and sense of control, you might not wait to get a letter or an email through. You might just pick up the phone and speak to someone to feel reassured. The next big point is, again, the one I just mentioned, around calling. People are way more likely to call rather than self-serve online. The people that we did speak to who did try to self-serve online told us that they had a really bad online experience. And essentially it was a lot quicker and easier for them to resolve their query or issue by just picking up the phone. All of these tie together. If someone is stressed, if they're anxious and they need to get something resolved quite quickly, if they go online and try and sort it and it's taking too long, that's just going to add to their frustration and anxiety. And again, picking up the phone is going to be a much better way for them to resolve their issue and also to feel a bit more secure about the whole process. Another thing that came through was a trust element. Now, some users didn't feel a terrible amount of trust that issues were going to get fixed with the council. This was for a few different reasons, really, but essentially if it's important, if you're relying on money to pay certain bills, or if you're relying on housing benefit to keep a roof over yours and your children's heads, it's a big deal, and people will worry if things are or aren't getting sorted, especially if they've had an experience where a mistake has been made. They will feel, the need to kind of stay on top of it and to keep calling to make sure that all the details are correct. and to make sure that process is being followed and things are getting sorted. Finally, this last point is, one thing that we found through speaking with people and through speaking to people at the council as well, is that a lot of people who are needing help from the council might be kind of what you might call repeat customers. Essentially, they have an ongoing need for support, which means that they need to periodically ask for support or give supporting evidence. It might mean that they are earning more or less in the months or years ahead. So they need to keep giving evidence or need to keep that communication line open with the council. Another part of this is that, for some users, especially in regards to things like housing benefits, in terms if the council is going to help them get a home or switch, it means that things can move from being quite slow. You might be on a waiting list and there's nothing really that you can do, to all of a sudden it becomes urgent. All of a sudden it's like, okay, there's a flat available in 2 weeks' time. You need to move quickly and you need to get all of these things done. And from a user's perspective, a lot of this can cause a lot of anxiety, so you don't feel like you're in control of that process or those timings. It might be that a letter comes through with, you need to act within a fortnight, and what if you're in hospital? What if you're ill? What if you miss the letter? There's so many reasons why things could not go to plan. So overall, from a user's experience, things are very highly charged, with a lot of anxiety around, especially seeking benefits and supports from the council. With all of this said, we created 2 experience maps. From the 7 people that we spoke to, there was 2 very clear kind of journeys emerging. One was for people that are just having billing or general inquiries around council tax and benefits, and the other one was around the applying or switching housing benefits. The second one is a way longer journey that can take months, even years, to resolve itself or to continue to be unresolved, as we'll soon see. Starting off with the first one, though, and again, I'm not expecting you to be able to read everything that you see on here, but I'll just read out like some of the key things we found from the more simple journeys around, billing and simple inquiries. You would always start with an event. This would either be context, life circumstance changes, or something like a letter coming through from the council, which has prompted them to want to call. I want to bear in mind that if this is the case, if users have received a letter, and that's the reason why they are contacting the council, they are way more likely to just call the council directly using a phone number that they might find on the letter. They are not likely at all to then go online, find Google, find a website, find information. If people receive a letter and there's a mistake or there's something that needs sorting, they will just pick up the phone and dial the number that they can find on the letter immediately. Overall, with this journey, you'll have, it start off with this push, this event that happens. They might or might not search online, depending if it's a letter or not. When they contact the council, it's quite interesting because people said that they will initially contact the council, whether it's calling or by email. And this is either to inquire, to request a service, maybe complain about something. But when it comes to kind of resolving it, or what is the next step, I heard from people that if they called, they would have to send a follow-up email, or they would email, but they have to call a particular number. So it always seemed like it wasn't a very simple resolution. They kind of had to take a few steps in order to resolve that simple query. A key thing that came through with all of these, and as you can see, most of these faces around here are not very happy. I think it's no big surprise that if it's anything to do with money, people get quite stressed and get quite worried. But around this, people, again, they need that reassurance from the council. I had people telling me, I need help, I don't know what to do, like, how come I'm being expected to know the name of the form? Like, I don't know what forms I have to fill in. or, oh, I need to keep chasing up the council, I need to avoid mistakes being made, like I don't want another mistake to come up in the future. Other people saying the forms are just too complicated, they struggle to understand the forms which are being sent to them. But ultimately, one of the biggest things that came through around reassurance is the idea of receipts. When it comes to communication channels, people love things like emails and written communications because it gives them a log of conversations which have happened. I've had users tell me that, sometimes they get a phone call or a letter through saying, oh, you can't have this service because you didn't send your paperwork. And they have to send trails and trails of emails that prove that they did send the paperwork, but just someone didn't pick it up. So again and again, you kind of have this story of a need for reassurance across this journey. Oops, excuse me. Similarly, for the housing, it all starts with an event, usually the need for council housing, or maybe the one that you have is no longer appropriate. This could happen for lots of different reasons, more kids, someone maybe has an accident and is disabled and needs everything on one floor. Something happens and they need to react to it. They will then contact the council and try to coordinate that whole process. This process in particular was quite complicated, a lot of back and forths, a lot of different third-party organizations getting involved. And this is where a lot of the issues were coming through from this journey in particular. They weren't quite sure, users weren't quite sure who to get in touch with. Is it the council? Is it the housing association? Who's in control? Who's responsible? Am I responsible? Who do I need to talk to? In one case, this lady was waiting for over a year for a house, and when she was finally offered one, she then found out that she had to pay a deposit, and she had no clue about this. And it comes to show that deep down, people need more education and more hand-holding. And generally speaking, it sounds like people might not want to have access to, not to have access to, but they would rather not be in a position where they had to seek support from the government or from the councils. But they are in that situation, they're anxious, and therefore just need a little bit of hand-holding. And again, all you can see here are kind of mad or sad faces. Overall, from all of these journeys, people were very, very anxious and struggling to try and have a situation resolved. The key quotes I wanted to share with you today: I like doing things myself, but I needed help. I needed someone to explain things to me. It was quicker than me taking forever to figure something out. And then secondly, if it's got to this point, I need to take control and make sure that I don't get another surprise. With both of these, it's talking either from the point of someone needs reassurance and needs hand-holding, to I don't trust that this thing is going to get done properly. I need to keep calling to make sure that it does get done, so I don't have an unexpected surprise that affects my life. With that being said, then I'll hand over to Tom, who's going to talk to you about his stakeholder findings.
Thank you, Louisa. All right, so I spoke to eight people across the councils, and also analysed the data, which we'll get to in a moment. But some key findings. Really, the majority of contacts require multiple touch points via a number of different channels. But this is quite in contrast to waste that we were looking at last week, where practically every contact could be resolved with a single phone call or single transaction on the internet, on the websites. So that's something to be factored in to our analysis, as you'll see in later slides. The ability for people to self-serve is really limited because not all of the services within revenues and benefits are available online. For example, change of circumstances forms or viewing council tax balance. The services which weren't available varied across the different councils, but this does have an impact on the ability to to attempt to transition people into a self-service model. As Louisa has clearly demonstrated, the conversations are very sensitive, emotional, and nearly every single case is unique. So the ability to have transcripts or very predictable patterns for call center operatives to respond with is not as predictable as it was in the previous weeks. A lot of the user journeys do involve referral to third-party services beyond the councils. And again, this adds a further element of complication. And sometimes those journeys then include referral back through the councils. So it's not a simple linear transaction within the council. These are emotional, complex journeys, and people do express a preference for human conversations, and that goes hand in hand with a risk for chatbot confusion. The language, the terminology, and the emotion is definitely at the complex human end of the scale. Before I move on to calling out specific data observations, I'd like to qualify all of it with a few points around the challenges from the data this week. There were, the data at a top level, the data is quite patchy across the different councils for a number of reasons. Looking at the call center data, unlike in the previous 2 weeks, there are dedicated phone numbers. In some cases, there's one phone number for council tax, one phone number for benefits, and calls coming through the switchboard. And no single council provided aggregated data across all of those. So that did make it harder to assess call volumes and to draw dependable conclusions. So when data was shared, it was for the main switchboard, the call center. Now we know that the vast majority, nearly every single call, gets transferred from switchboard or first line teams to the back office teams. And so there are many more conversations taking place than have been represented in the data. When looking at the analytics setup, none of the councils had event tracking in place or site search. So again, that limits our abilities to draw meaningful conclusions. And there was no data for the drop-in or home visit services, which we do know that face-to-face provision is both important, that it's common, and that it's also very expensive. And yet we're not able to reflect that in these figures. And there's also no cost or no data provided for costs of processing physical mail. And we know, in particular, some of the councils, they still have forms up they're really just PDF versions of old physical forms that people have to print out at home, fill in by hand, send in, and then someone in the council office will scan it and upload it and append it to a digital folder or record. But again, we don't have any costs associated with that process. Sorry, that feels like an awful lot of caveats, but I have still been able to draw some meaningful observations from the data that we were provided with. So looking at the top level in terms of call volumes, revenues and benefits makes up a really significant chunk of total calls. Now, as I already said, this is looking at calls into the main switchboard call center. So it would be possible to take this at face value and say, well, this is ripe for a chatbot because there's just so many calls. So there's potential for saving here. Those in last week we quantified that potential for waste at 275k. For planning, it was 45k per council. The cost of provisioning that slice of calls, revenues and benefits here, just looking at call volumes, is just shy of 300k. But it's a big but. we've got to consider the ability for call centres to resolve those calls. Last week we saw in waste and recycling, pretty much every single call that was coming in could be resolved by that first line agent who could process the transaction or order a new bin or point the user towards the right web page, or complete whatever need it was that had driven the call in the first place. It's the opposite picture with revenues and benefits. I spoke to 2 of the call centre staff and a call centre team lead. They are not in the business of resolving any, pretty much, calls that are coming in. They are really acting as triage agents to transfer people to a subsequent phone call in the right team. Whether that's within revenues, benefits, financial hardship, or so on and so forth. But this is really important to factor in, along with the high volume of calls that we're seeing, is the low percentage of calls that can be resolved by that first line agent, which results in a picture of significantly lower potential chatbot gain financially when you aggregate the call volumes by that resolution rate. So with waste and recycling, that's a really high number for potential savings, because a lot of them, they all get resolved at that first phone conversation. But even if we had a chatbot in place, the vast majority of those revenues and benefits calls need to be transferred through to a human back office agent for resolution. Just to remind us of this slide that we looked at last week. So, really, this escalates from the bottom to the top in terms of complexity, and the best use cases for chatbots where it's a simple information request or a simple task-based inquiry, making an order, completing a transaction, submitting a form. But where it's a complex, human-driven inquiry, where it's a matter of subjectivity or debate or specialist knowledge, it's less of a good use case for chatbots. So when we then look at the main reasons for people calling within revenues and benefits, the vast majority of calls are for, even where they're what we'd call an information request or a task request, these are things that require some element of human interaction, because they are complex, they have supplementary documentation that needs review, or it's a matter of debate, or it's inappropriate for the task to be handled without a human member of the council in place. So the result of that is that a lot of these calls are falling into that top category that we're calling complex human, which really isn't the sweet spot for considering chatbots. Another thing that I'd want to call out, just from my observations from speaking to people across a number of councils in a number of different roles, is whether it's appropriate to lump these two together. From the start, we've been talking about revenues and benefits. There's some very different services and user journeys that are captured under that. In fact, they're different teams within the councils handling revenues and benefits. And therefore, to question whether it's appropriate to even bundle them together and consider them as one under this research topic. As I just said, there's different teams within the councils who are provisioning these services. Customer data is handled via different systems. Often the CRMs aren't one and the same, so your council tax record is not showing on your benefits record or your housing benefit record. So again, that's another reason for questioning whether these two belong as a single service area. And lastly, in closing, some observations. So really interestingly, speaking to people from Redditch and Bromsgrove, there's quite different demographic traits across those two councils, which makes a real difference to the type of services people are requesting. So Redditch is a very young population, people move around a lot, lots of change of address, whereas Bromsgrove is rural, lots of people within benefits, and they see quite different trends in terms of which services under that broad label of revenues and benefits that people are using. Looking at the website data, there's really few sessions compared to other services. So council tax for a year, on average, across the councils, 27,000 unique page views. Benefits, really low, 2.2K. Waste, by contrast, looking at the councils from last week, seeing very high number, over 100,000 on average per council page views per year, which suggests that, as Louisa observed from the user perspective, this is an area where people are inclined to pick up the phone and less inclined to do the self-service and find their answers online. Whereas, as we saw within waste, it's actually a lot of the information is there, a lot of the services are available through self-service, and people are inclined to just sort it out themselves via the website. So, as you saw at the start, despite a really high volume of calls, which would, at face value, make itself appear that this is good territory for a chatbot, the nature of those calls makes it less so. They're complex, they're emotional, they require multiple touch points, and that makes it less appropriate to consider a chatbot at this time. But within that being said, there are some potential use cases. So triaging, there's a very obvious potential use case for people to get quicker and more seamlessly in touch with the appropriate back office team, rather than waiting on a switchboard, which at certain times of year, particularly right now, there can be really long queues. So there's potential there. There's potential for taking payments. But again, that would depend on a far more robust integration with CRM and other systems that currently isn't necessarily in place, for a chatbot to be able to take payments, or for people to be able to query, for example, their status of their benefits claim or their council tax balance. And also, a real use case is providing reassurance or updates. A very significant volume of calls were from people who'd already made an initial contact with the council and were just following up to find out what had happened to that initial request. And this is something that fairly simply is potentially through AI-based SMS contact. We could look at provisioning updates to requests so that people aren't picking up the phone just to ask, hey, what's happening? Lastly, close with a quote, which I think wrapped up neatly this research area for the week. There's so much complexity within benefits. It's important not to make generalizations because every case is different. We have to make sure we give correct advice, that they understand it, and that it's clear. I think that last bit is really important. There is so much risk in this territory with the potential of giving incorrect advice, or advice that is misunderstood or misinterpreted. And by removing a human from that, I feel that risk is only exacerbated. So it's just something to really bear in mind when considering this area for chatbots or AIs. Yeah, that's everything I've got. I think now, I'm not sure if we've got anybody representing revenues and benefits, but it would be great to open it up to the rest of the group.
We have anyone else here who's done their own research on revenues and benefits?
Ian from Preston.
Oh, excellent.
Hi, Ian.
Hey, Ian.
Hi, how are you doing? All right. Not really a great deal to add, to be honest. Just, yeah, it's we got the similar sort of results, really. Some very, very anxious people. To one of the interviews where we had a guy break down on us. So some real emotion, and yeah, it was quite mind blowing to watch, really, certainly from my point of view where I hadn't had that experience before. So yeah, it was good. We use an IVR system, which is that telephone system where you press 1 to do that and 2 to do that. And I think all 6 users that we spoke to sort of explained their frustration at that and how frustrating it was to the fact that they wanted to just get through to an advisor, and there's, like you said, Louisa, the anxiousness of having this bill or this debt hanging over you to then have to go through the system. Then that was quite frustrating. The slowness one as well. I think we're on about a 16-week backlog now for various council tax and revenue inquiries. So, and that's mainly down to resources more than anything. A lot of mental health issues as well. A lot of the people that we spoke to had similar sort of mental health issues. We spoke to one chap who said it took him 3 weeks to find his passport gateway number. He was completing our housing benefit form, and it's not actually us that you get that off, but we didn't know, so we sent him to DWP, who you get that number off, and they didn't know either, so they sent him back to the council. And then we sent him back to DWP, and eventually he got it, but that took him 3 weeks. So again, as you can see, the complexity and the confusion of that. So, and yeah, I think that's all I've got really. But yeah, similar type of findings really.
It's very interesting that you mention definitely the emotional aspect of it. Being new to doing these sort of like interviews, did you find it difficult? How did you resolve that in terms of managing that conversation?
It was tough really, because it was knowing what to do with a chap that's sort of broken down on you really. You just want to give him a cuddle, but obviously he didn't want that. So yeah, it was a very funny situation really, but yeah, just sort of mind-blowing really. You sort of feel a bit lucky really that you're not in that situation. I mean, again, going back to when we did the training, all 6 people opened up so much, and I couldn't believe how much they did open up and shared their experiences of life really. So it's amazing how you can really get under people's skin, and they tell you their lives really. So
yeah,
that was interesting.
and we had we had very pretty much very similar situations. I also had very watery eyes. I nearly cried myself. You can't help it when you see someone going through that.
Yeah.
But it just comes to show again how much anxiety, and as much as people are, as one lady said, soldering on as best as they can, it just shows how important it is to get that reassurance, and that little bit of hand holding goes a very long way. In regards, you mentioned about the backlog, and that in terms of this is a very busy time of year for you. I heard from one user saying that she had a very similar experience, but it was around Christmas time. Do you have other times of the year that you experience certain backlogs, or is it something that's predominantly around this time of year?
I think ours is just pretty much flatline type across the board. We sort of varied, obviously, like you say, it's busy at this time, but yeah, it's usually at least 6 to 12 weeks to get your thing action, no matter what time of year it is. So again, it's just it's pretty constant, I think. So
Yeah, that's our experience in Oxford, is that the backlog is a constant thing. It's not like we have peaks with students for council tax, people moving in and out, but for benefits, it's because it's complicated. And one of the issues is often people need to send in extra information or clarify information, and that's a lot of toing and froing. So that ability to resolve quickly is really, really reduced. We did look at something using what's it going to be called, risk-based verification, where if you put someone's national insurance number in and it goes through a series of checks and said this is a low risk person, you don't need to go through those additional checks on documentation. A good example would be pensioners. They're unlikely to be changing income radically. They are kind of set in their ways, so you just pass those claims straight through. So when we looked at this a few years ago, 7 years ago now, the team had an ambition to get from claim to pay in a day, and it is possible to do it very, very quickly, but it is not possible for everyone. Can I just come back to you on some of the data you found? Because I was quite surprised by that, about the idea that so many of the calls have to be passed through, because that's not what happens in Oxford. A great deal of, I would say, the majority of things are resolved at the front desk. We have well-trained customer service advisors who do most of the work, so the benefits team themselves are left dealing with the applications themselves and writing letters, but they, generally speaking, all the calls are dealt with by the front desk.
Yeah, that sounds very different, Neil. I'm just pulling up my my data sheet from the calls so I can call out which council in particular we saw this with.
And also, you're mentioning that council tax moves was a human issue. I don't really agree with that. We have, and maybe it's because we have so much of that coming through online that.
Yeah, well, I think this is really important as a bigger point, is how different the councils are with what's available. You know,
right.
Which services can be done online, which websites have forms that can be filled in electronically and appended automatically to a digital record versus those that need to be printed out. There's a lot of discrepancy there, which does mean that sort of trying to sort of think of a one chatbot fits all solution would be tricky.
But you're absolutely right about the amount of stuff that is available online, because one of the things that we're looking at is a change of circumstances online form, because it's such a trivial thing. My wage has changed because inflation has changed, whatever. I just need to provide someone with a payslip. It's not a complex process. It's just very, very transactional. But at the moment, the system we use, given this is going to be published online, I won't say who it is, the supplier doesn't offer a form to do that. So we're looking at going to another supplier just to do that. But we know that we can save an awful lot of contact if we give the people the ability to do that. The same with providing information. One of the systems we're looking at provides, not only hard data about this is your balance, but contextual information that dresses it in a form of words. So it's more of a data story. Quite attractive, a bit expensive, but because we deal with so much, it's looking like a good business case for us. Okay, interesting. Just to go back to the point around the switchboard. So it's Redditch and Bromsgrove, where I spoke to a first line operative, and I mean, here's part of the quote. We take all the calls that come in from the general public and transfer calls to each destination. Our role is to get the person from A to B as quickly as possible. We take calls for both Redditch and Bromsgrove, and calls for anything. It can really vary. As soon as we know what they want, we can put them through to the right department. People are sometimes distressed if they can't get through to the right team and come back through to us on the switchboard. When we put them through to council tax, there are further options. A lot of people are expecting to speak to a human straight away. So, but she was clear in that they're not resolving anyone. They're not pointing people even towards web pages. Mm. They are sort of acting as a human triage.
I think there's a really interesting quote which I mentioned this morning with you, Tom, and I think it's worth sharing with the group. It was this man who has issues with both physical and some mental disabilities that we spoke with, but he really struggles to kind of concentrate on forms and everything. He doesn't particularly like being on the phone too much. He would prefer to write things down, write an email because he can take his time thinking about it. And we asked him about things around like messaging, like an online chat situation, to see whether that's something that he would like or not. And he gave a gem of a quote, which was, "Those online chat things should go to prison in Russia and never come back, because every time I try and speak to someone on these online chats, They can never help me with what I need. They're always just giving me a number, a contact number, or someone to get in touch with that could help me. So it goes back to that point around people are already starting their journeys from a point of anxiety or frustration. And if you're putting anything in between them and getting a solution to their problem, it's going to heighten that frustration, particularly if it was something online, like an online chat, or if we can imagine like a chatbot, like a robot or something that's not responding to what you need. It's just all pointing in the direction of something that isn't quite appropriate to deal with those types of queries.
Louise, John here. I think the other point is we've got limited resources. So although people would like face-to-face human contact, that's not always available. And I just think if we can sift out some of the lower level stuff, like Neil was saying, change the circumstances, single person discount, we can then free up more resource to dedicate towards the more complex issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting, the ones that you mentioned around things like change of circumstance, in the sense that if that's like a repeatable thing, that repeats customer, or someone who isn't going to the council for the first time and doesn't know what they're doing, but this is part of an ongoing relationship, I guess, and like an ongoing expectation, an ongoing process. At that point, I can imagine how it's a bit more part of process and habit of sending documentation, rather than it being, you know, that initial point of anxiety where you're reaching out for help and you don't know what you're doing. So there's definitely scope to explore things a bit further. But definitely very interesting, the point that every council is doing things. So is, you know, we're hearing about two very different cases of how councils are approaching this. For us, what's really interesting to hear is that we're trying to understand, like, in what cases would a chatbot be relevant and in what cases would it not be relevant. So at the moment, we're kind of gathering all of these different kind of elements of the service provision to help put together a bit of a framework, right? Of, you know, how can you understand, based on what you currently have, would a chatbot be or not be relevant, or valuable, as something to consider.
Yeah, I think it's what's really come through for me in what you found so far is that aspect of emotion is almost pertinent to the solution that you go for. So everyone deals with waste, which is why the calls are so high. Everyone has a bin, and that's the whole cross section of your council residents. Yes. And so you are going to get highly skilled people, articulate people, as well as people who have more of a struggle articulating their issues. But they're simple problems. Bin wasn't collected. I need a new bin. They're very, very transactional. So that I got very excited last week when we were talking about that, because it just seemed such a sensible area to focus on.
Yeah, they're very predictable. It's a very small set of tasks that people are looking to do. And in terms of the back office structure of councils, there's a lot more parity between the different councils in terms of even down to the particular systems that they're using, as contrasted with this week, where it's all over the place across the different councils in terms of how they're structured, how they're set up, which systems they're using, the extent to which those systems integrate with other systems. So yeah, definitely waste felt significantly more confined to a predictable number of use cases, and easy to envisage how something could plug into that relatively straightforwardly.
The other aspect I think you hit the nail on the head, what I really liked, is why is it revenues and benefits? Why have we lumped these things together? And the real answer is because that's how we like to lump it together. It's nothing to do with the service provision to the public or what they think of. Someone moving into an area isn't going to consider themselves part of the same service as someone who desperately needs help with housing benefit. But
Yeah.
yet nearly all of us lump this thing together, probably because the software systems as well sort of force us down that road. Well, you want to do revenues and benefits, here's your system. I think it's very rare for them to be separate.
Right.
Sorry, can I just say about the council tax? Because I spoke to a few people about council tax, and they were all people who had successfully dealt with their council tax. So for my personal sort of look at that, because I didn't talk to anyone from the benefit. Well, I did one person about benefits, but that was straightforward, and there wasn't. A lot of them did actually do it over online. The one thing that they can't do online at the moment is direct debit. So they have to phone up to do a direct debit. But actually, for straightforward council tax setup and things like that, it is almost self-serve. So in terms of council tax opposed to revenues, it is very different, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I thought that in regards to payments, that there was a lot of difference between with the people I spoke to, whether they preferred to and were comfortable with technology in terms of just setting up a direct debit and just checking things through online, through online banking and making online transfers. And other people wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. They prefer picking up the phone and doing it as and when. Some people wanted, the kind of the different channels that they're using did very much speak to how much reassurance they needed in terms of having physical receipts, in terms of having physical evidence that they have made a payment, also bearing in mind their different ages and levels of ability. Or, for example, if you're retired or if you're disabled and you don't work because of that disability, getting out of your house and going into the council to pay a bill might be just a good enough reason to get you out of the house. So people's context, like life context, definitely are very big drivers to which channels they choose to use. So I think that's another thing to consider as well in terms of the demographic that each council is servicing. Are there any other key findings that anyone else had around this, or any sort of big lessons learned ahead of our final week with highways next week?
Sorry, it isn't a finding so much. It's just I had a conversation with one person who talked about. I'm not really sure about the whole council tax system, but he said he wasn't paying council tax until this year, and suddenly it's been introduced that he now has to pay council tax, and it was something that the members decided, and he's challenging it. I just wonder, to those that are actually in that sort of department, whether that's something, is that across the board, that's something that's changed across for everyone, or is it just something that's just happened for us?
My guess would be that's something to do with discretionary allowances. I'm certainly not in that area, but I know that each council has its own scheme. We've just reviewed ours recently. So it might be that, Claire. That's the only thing I can think of.
Thank you. It was just something I wasn't aware of, and so the reason why he was contacting us was because we had changed the circumstances. His circumstances hadn't changed. It was ours that had changed. So, yeah. I know it's slightly off topic, slightly from this particular project, but in this, especially around council tax and the sharing of data, I just heard that is there an AI around being able to share data between the different services anonymously or automatically redacted or something? Because as you said before, that when someone's coming in to do their council tax or their benefits or their payment, I don't know, everyone has a different system, and there isn't any link up. And I wondered whether there was a frustration around, well, if I've told the council tax one thing, why do I have to tell waste and recycling the same thing? I just wondered whether there's facilitate an AI solution around that?
I think that in terms of the problem that you just raised, that's something that I definitely heard from users, particularly around the point of for example, if they're looking for a housing benefit, for example, people get confused between, like, is it the council, is it the housing association? Because they're kind of interlinked. They kind of all put them into one big pocket and just see them as one and the same service. And people get confused as to, the separation and who's responsible for what. That is one point of confusion, which, if you were to deep dive into that, there may be more things around, how many people need my personal details and, get my payment slips and all the rest of it. There was another user that I spoke to who said that when she was, that was like an elderly lady, but she said that when she was younger, as like single mom of 3, she was going to apply for, some discounts on, or some benefits and support. But because she was going to have to give copies of pay slips and banking details, she saw that as like an infringement of her privacy, or she saw that as being like too much to do. So she would rather not disclose that sort of personal information because she doesn't know what's going to happen with it and what the council's going to do with it. So again, it goes back to that point of trust, but it was so important to her that she would rather not get the help than share that sort of information. It seems from our chats with users that there seems to be some breakdowns in communication between the different organizations. I'm not quite sure around how AI or chatbots would or wouldn't kind of help with that situation, especially around privacy. I'm not quite sure whether that's something that at the moment is something that I could comment on. We'd have to have further conversations.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of cases, for an AI system to be able to be speaking to these various databases or other systems, document management systems, they themselves already need to be speaking to each other and connected. And in many cases, particularly in the case of Redditch and Bromsgrove, those systems aren't connected. They're members of the team are leaving messages within document management systems for other teams to append uploaded versions of physical documents. And before you even get onto the issue of security, which yes, AI and chatbot solutions can redact certain fields and can handle this data in a way that meets compliance and GDPR requirements. But in order to have any solution that can do that, these systems need to be able to talk to each other in the first place, which in many cases isn't yet the case, although it's on a lot of teams' radars that they're working on projects that will provide better integration, but we're not quite there yet.
Any more thoughts around findings? Maybe thoughts on what we presented earlier, or maybe something that came out which is quite different from what we said? And if not, kind of instead of talking about findings and things that we've learned, is there anything that anyone is like still unsure about, or any questions about the process ahead of our final research week in Surrey next week? Okay, it's pretty. Seems pretty clear then. I guess just to kind of wrap everything up is just we're going to be in Surrey next week to focus on highways. Next week is going to be quite different for us in the sense that Surrey is the only council that we are looking into. So, in these past few weeks, what we've been able to do is to get data from different councils, and sometimes we're using like one council's data rather than another one because maybe there's a bit richer data there that we can use and to dive into. So I think that is the biggest thing for us, is trying to make sure that we get as much as possible from Surrey next week, and we're hoping that the quality of the data will be in tip-top form to make sure we get the best value out of next week.
But as with every week, an open invitation to supply data from your councils, it really helps to make sure, particularly in this case where there's only one council, to make sure that we're not dealing with real anomalous data or outliers. But helps.
I think the issue, Tom, is that I think Surrey might be the only highways authority.
Okay.
So it's not, but we do look after some bits of Oxford on an agency basis, so we can talk about potholes, but only recently. So I'm not sure. Well, I certainly can't do it now. I'm not sure we can provide data to support that, and it probably wouldn't be the same sorts of conversations, because highways can cover a remit of things from parking to traffic orders to whatever. If it's potholes, then that's one thing. And I know Chris is a little anxious. It's all going to be about potholes, but maybe that is what people want to talk about. So for me, I mean, it gives a chance to just maybe spend a bit more time on their stuff. I'm interested to see what comes out of it.
Perfect. All right.
Great. Well, are there any other questions before we all go away and enjoy our Friday afternoons?
Sorry, when you're saying, Neil said about potholes for Oxford, I mean, the only data that I might have would be around parking. Is that of any interest or not really at all? I'm not really sure what you'll be looking at in terms of highways and data.
I'm very happy to have your data, Claire, with the caveat that I can't promise that it'll be included in the analysis. But yeah, I haven't dug into what Surrey have sent me already beyond a cursory glance to make sure that it's intact, and it is. But yeah, I'll be immediately after this turning my head into highways mode. So do feel free to send through parking data, potholes data, you name it, and I'll.
What you may be able to get, Tom, is we use Fix My Street in Oxford and Oxfordshire, so we do have data on volumes reported through the year for different things that have a highways connotation.
Okay.
I think you were able to get that data for anywhere across the country. I might be wrong. I'll have a look this afternoon and see what I can find.
Okay, fantastic. Oh yeah, it looks like even from 10 seconds on the site, like there's a lot of data that's open access on that site. Nice. Yeah.
But the caveat there is not everyone promotes it heavily. So I know that West Berkshire get very, very few reports because they have their own online forms, whereas we've decided locally that because Oxfordshire went for Fix My Street, we would go for that exclusively too. So we don't have our own. That's our prime method of getting reports in online.
All right. Well, that's it from us. It's 4 o'clock. It's just gone 4 o'clock. But thank you everyone again for joining us today. Hopefully you found it valuable. It's always really valuable for us to share our findings and to see what everyone else has to say, see whether it's echoed or not. So yeah, super valuable for us, and thanks for joining. And hope you all have a great weekend, and to keep on our custom of celebrating and saying congratulations to someone. I guess congratulations to all the mamas out there for Happy Mom Day for Sunday. And yeah, I guess that's my congratulations.
Congratulations, Neil, on being about an hour and a half away from holiday time.
Thank you. I'm not leaving till tomorrow night, but just to Brittany, just a little flit across the water.
Lovely. Well, everyone have a lovely evening, have a lovely weekend, and I'll speak to you all next week.
Thank you. Have a good
Yeah.
weekend.
Bye,
And
everyone.
you, yeah,
Bye.
bye everyone. Next
Bye.
week. Bye. Bye.
What were the chats? No.
Let me see.
Okay.